9, 8, 7, 6, 5.
On this week's Texas Tribune TribCast, we'll talk about the inaugurations of the state's top 2 leaders, our regular Big 3 boogie check, a Texas candidate in the presidential race, and Puerto Rico as a key primary state, the proposed state budgets and education proposals for the House and Senate, or from the House and Senate, and yet another special election. But before we get to all of that, I'd like to thank today's TribCast sponsors. Today's TribCast is presented by Harmony Public Schools. Texas's largest STEM-focused free charter school system is accepting applications now at campuses statewide. Visit harmonytx.org to see why the TEA awarded Harmony 6A ratings for 2018. And by Don't Blow It, Save Wild Texas. Visit don'tblowittexas.org and join the Devil's River Conservancy in protecting our state for future generations. Hello, this is Ross Ramsey here on Wednesday, January 16th with the Texas Tribune TribCast, our weekly Texas politics and policy podcast. I'm joined this week by reporters Alex Samuels.
Hi there.
Aaliyah Swaby.
Hello.
And Patrick Svitek.
Good afternoon.
As always, we take your questions in real time on Twitter and Facebook. You can ask us by using the hashtag TribCast. So I want to start with your foreign adventures, Patrick. We've got another, I guess, our first official Texas presidential candidate, and he started in a new primary state. You want to run this down for us?
Right. So on Saturday, I guess I'll go back to Saturday, Julian Castro made official what a lot of people have been expecting for a long time, for basically the past 2 years, which is that he announced he's running for president, joining what's probably going to be a very crowded field and which has only grown since Saturday.
Yeah, we've got 6 new candidates.
Exactly.
Right?
So it's moving at a pretty fast pace at this point in the cycle. And he announced in his hometown of San Antonio on the west side, near where he grew up, and made the west side and his life story on the west side pretty central to his announcement. And right afterward chose as his first post-announcement trip San Juan, Puerto Rico, which is politically significant in a number of ways. Obviously, he is going to be courting the Latino vote pretty intensely, and working to build, an even broader coalition than just the Latino vote, of course. And then there was just kind of this, obvious contrast with the current occupant of the White House, who was, pretty sharply and roundly criticized for his administration's response to Hurricane Maria in 2017. And so Castro clearly wanted to kind of drive home the message that he would be, a president who would take just as seriously a natural disaster that hits Puerto Rico as one that would hit Texas,
right?
And brought this message to the island, saying that he wants to make sure that everybody counts. And it just wasn't a very traditional first stop for a presidential candidate. Usually they go to Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, one of the early voting states.
I sort of wondered if people looked up at this point at some candidate from Texas for president and wondered what the heck that guy was doing. I mean, did they seem to be sort of conscious of, here we are, this is a presidential thing, this is exciting, or was it sort of like, what's going on here?
So one of the events he did was he spoke Monday morning at the Latino Victory Fund's political summit, which was being held in Puerto Rico for many of the same reasons from a political perspective, to kind of shine a light on the ongoing recovery there, and in contrast with the Trump administration's response to it. The Latino Victory Fund is a group that he has long been involved with, and that has kind of he's been involved with this. He's risen from San Antonio mayor to a cabinet official to now a presidential candidate. So that was a crowd that was very familiar with him. Mm-hmm. It was a room full of kind of very influential Hispanic elected officials and political activists and
from all over
leaders
the
and
country.
donors. So that crowd was pretty familiar with him. There was no surprise there. He then afterward did 2 different stops throughout San Juan, where he kind of checked in on neighborhoods that were still damaged and recovering, and also looked at some various kind of recovery efforts. He was obviously kind of a fresher face in those neighborhoods, and not as well known per se. And so I guess that would be a case where people would crane their neck and say, who's this guy from Texas? But, overall, though, it was a pretty, he was pretty well received throughout the trip. And, this Democratic primary is going to be so crowded, so diverse, that, it's going to require a lot to stand out. And he needs all the help he can get. Obviously, he is starting this race out as what I would classify as a long shot. I mean, barely registering in polls, and here in Texas being overshadowed, at least for the moment, by Beto O'Rourke, who's just drawing so much more attention as a potential candidate.
Who just came off a big, huge, multi-million-dollar campaign, right?
Right, exactly. Right. And so if the goal was to kind of try to move quickly after his announcement to distinguish himself, I think he was successful. But this race is, as we just pointed out, moving very quickly, and it's going to require a lot of sustained effort to kind of carve out a unique profile.
It's super early to ask this, but is there anything here that looks like this is going to separate him from the pack in terms of issues, or in terms of, something about him that, is going to make him stand out? And I mean, I saw something a couple of weeks ago that said there are actually 36 people who are looking at this, who are, serious people with national profiles or want to be national profiles. How do you break out?
Yeah, I think in terms of issues, you look at his announcement speech on Saturday in San Antonio, and he pretty much rattled off a lot of ideas progressive ideas that are very ascendant in the Democratic Party right now. Medicare for all, affordable, and today he went even further and he said, talked about free tuition for public colleges, and universal pre-K. I mean, these are all ideas that are ascendant in an increasingly progressive Democratic mainstream. And so I think he's starting out this campaign pretty well aligned with that, with kind of where the Democratic primary electorate is going to be when votes are finally start being cast in 2020.
Okay. And next stop, New Hampshire?
Yeah, he already is in New Hampshire. He went to New Hampshire on Tuesday, and then
might be the first time he's ever seen snow. This could be a big day, right?
Exactly. And so, and then he's there on today, Wednesday, as well. So obviously a little more traditional backdrop for a presidential candidate in Puerto Rico.
So we're off and running. It's only 2 years till election day. So here in Texas, we've been talking about, I guess, just two things. We're sort of walking, we're watching the state leadership since the election, really talking about, it's just going to be school finance and what's that other one? Oh, yeah, property taxes.
Property taxes, I think, yeah.
Sorry, little Rick Perry moment. So, Leah, walk us through the school finance stuff. I know if you say school finance, that in a room full of 12 people, you can get 12 different versions of it. Do you have a feel yet for what they're talking about?
Yeah, so I think the House and Senate budget proposals in the last couple of days have shown a little bit about what they mean by school finance fixes. I don't think it's shown very much about what they mean by property tax relief in terms of specific proposals. The House seems to be, the House is, I think, proposing $9 billion more for public education. And they're sort of more vague on the policy side. So it's anything that, it's contingent on special education fixes, more money for schools, and property tax reform.
But it's sort of a general statement about those things and not really do this specific thing or this specific thing. Right.
Yeah. Whereas the Senate's was really different in dividing up those into two separate items. So there's about $3.7 billion in there that's just for teacher pay raises. So it would basically require school districts to use the money to give $5,000 raises to all their full-time classroom teachers.
Is it a raise on top of what those teachers are already making, or is this a raise in the basic amount the teachers have to make?
So the language of the bill makes it clear that it would have to be more than they were getting the previous year. And the language of the bill is also interesting because it is, an allotment. So it sort of like builds it into the distribution of how school finance works, but it expires in 2020. So it'll be interesting to see, what that actually means, if anyone will pick up on that. So
it expires. Does that mean that the state won't provide the $5,000 anymore, or does that mean that it's not part of the school formulas anymore, or is that clear?
I don't think that's clear yet. Right. I think, if in future sessions, obviously, if they don't want to do it anymore, they won't do it anymore, and they can pretty easily do that. But it's unclear if, the allotment itself will, does the allotment mean anything without the money going to the allotment?
Right. Well, and the
know,
allotment,
but-
we should say, the allotment is basically when the state's distributing public education money, it says this much money per student, and that's how they equalize. So your school district gets the same as his school district
Right.
and hers, right?
Right. And so the problem has been in the past that lawmakers have relied a lot on grant programs, which are temporary and which can easily be, gotten rid of.
Right.
I think they're talking a lot more this year about building things into the actual formulas. And so I think that's why the Senate's bill looks this way. The way that they're proposing it looks this way. But it's unclear right now what that actually means for the future if it ends up being better than a grant program in terms of its. I mean, Lieutenant Governor has said that that it's permanent, that it would go in perpetuity, but obviously he can't bind future legislatures.
Right. The House also uses some of the money in the rainy day fund account to shore up. It's not exactly shortfalls, but shore up some liabilities in the teacher retirement system. The Senate doesn't do that.
Right.
Are there other big differences here?
I think, so the Senate uses rainy day fund for the supplemental budget.
This is the budget that for money in the current budget that's
Right.
not there.
Exactly.
Right.
And so I think there's about $1 billion in there for Hurricane Harvey damages, and some money for Medicaid. But yeah, the House mainly uses rainy day fund for some smaller future expenses, but not really for supplemental in the same way.
Yeah, Alex, how do these budgets stack up? I mean, what's this? Does this look like a grand fight, or does it look like they're kind of going in the same direction? I mean, just from the first glances at what the House filed, what the Senate filed, how's it looking?
Edgar Walters, our main budget reporter, had a story yesterday that showed, there are some major differences in the budget as far as education spending. I think the House wanted to put forth a little bit more money
Right.
than the Senate did, like a $3 billion difference there.
Right.
But something that he kind of noted at the end of his article is that, the budget differences this year aren't as stark as they were going to last year. And there's still, the big three, they're still kind of singing kumbaya on those big bread and butter policy issues, property taxes and school finance. So I think they're both trying to allocate money in their budgets to those different programs. I think there's just a difference in how much should be spent.
Right.
Yeah. Ross, maybe you can confirm me on this, but it seems like at the beginning you talk about the differences in the starting points between last session and this session. It seems that there were some real differences in principle on the starting points last session.
Right.
At least this session, there are some, there are some major numerical differences and kind of technical differences, but it seems like they're starting from the same place. They're starting more closely aligned in principle on some of these items.
Okay. Did you get a microphone sharing note?
Oh, no.
Yeah.
All right.
Can we just take it out?
Have an equipment malfunction. One of the things that seems evident right now, or seems to be the case right now, and emphasis on right now because we've got
Right.
18 weeks for this to come apart, is that they seem to be going in the same direction. As Alex points out, there's a difference in the totals on the budget. I think it's $4 billion overall, $3 billion in public education. They seem to be pretty much almost word for word in sync on Medicaid. They spend less money on Medicaid, and they contend that they can spend less money because they have better federal matches, and they won't lose any services. So we'll see how that goes. It's become a general habit in the state budget to not put all of the money you actually need for 2 years for Medicaid in the budget, and to pick it up in a supplemental bill. So, for example, they're going to start this session with Senate Bill 500, I think it is, which is a supplemental bill that'll catch up the current budget. It includes $2.1 billion that they didn't put in Medicaid that they need for Medicaid to make it to the end of the year.
Right.
So pretty typical operation there. But like you said, I mean, you and I went to the state convention in 2016. And that's where the bathroom bill popped up. And from there, that bill and a number of other things sort of became the conversation through that election and into the session. And we don't have anything, any comparable, culture war kind of issues going this time. I mean, there are some issues like that, but nothing amped up like that. They seem to be talking about these two topics,
right.
And then it's sort of like topic one, topic two, everything else.
Right. Yeah. I mean, there's obviously some border security chat, but that's being driven by what's happening at the national level.
Right.
And even then, besides Dan Patrick, you don't have Greg Abbott and new Speaker Bonin out there really banging the drum hard on that issue. I mean, they're really trying to keep it focused on these two big issues.
There's nothing in any of the budget proposals that says, this is to help build a big, beautiful wall.
Right. And in fact, we even saw this week Texas Republicans in some ways pull back from that idea, or at least pull back from a floated funding mechanism for that idea. Greg Abbott, Ted Cruz, John Cornyn, and a bunch of Republican congressmen teamed up to send a letter to Trump to say, hey, we're hearing reports that you may be interested in diverting some disaster relief funds to build the border wall. Don't do that.
Right.
Which was, I noted this, but Cornyn had been pretty vocal about this over the past few days. It was more interesting to see Ted Cruz and Greg Abbott especially sign on to that letter. And so,
well, they jumped in pretty hard. I mean, they
So
had
they're
to wrestle
strongly
pretty hard to
opposed.
get that money in the first place, and they probably, they don't steal our emergency funds.
Yeah.
Pretty interesting. So we had the inauguration.
Yes.
It was weird. It was on the wrong side of the Capitol. Everybody was talking about it being on the back door. I don't know that they've ever done that. It was on the north side.
It's a new day in Texas.
Instead of the south side. Well, the trees have gotten big enough that, one of the arguments was that you've ruined the sight lines so people can't see. I will note that it's also easier on the north side of the Capitol to fill the sidewalks. It's smaller sidewalks and get a big crowd. So what was the scene over there, Alex? What was what did we see here? It's basically a couple of speeches and
Couple speeches, and we all went home, basically. But no.
Chuck Norris.
I noticed they sat the UT band and the A&M band on either side of a hedge so they wouldn't have to look at each other.
Smart.
So Dan Patrick and Governor Abbott both spoke yesterday at the inaugurations. Something that was interesting, I know Chuck Lindell actually pointed this out in his Statesman piece, is that Dan Patrick in his speech was really pointing to bipartisanship and, both with Republicans and Democrats, then also the House and Senate working together this session to really work on those bread and butter policy issues that they've been kind of pushing a united front on, at least since the election, I'd say.
Right.
I think something...
United Front holds week 2, right?
I think it was interesting. I think Patrick had brought up Bonin on stage with him, a move that he said was unprecedented, just to show that the House and Senate are really focused on working together. And I know that we included a quote today in this morning's brief where he was like, the Democrats and Republicans are working together. And he said Patrick said something along the lines of, Washington could take note of, how we are all working together. So we'll just kind of see if that holds true in the next coming month.
Right. I mean, this was a lot of, this isn't the nicest term, but just kind of regurgitation of the themes that we've heard,
Right.
Really ever since the election, and especially ramped up at the beginning of the session. I know that one kind of specific thing that was a bit of news, at least in the moment, was Dan Patrick used his speech to kind of pre-announce Jane Nelson's teacher pay raise bill. And just lay out some of those details. But otherwise, this was a lot of what we've already been hearing.
Right.
And, I'm personally more looking forward to Greg Abbott's State of the State address, where I think you may get a little more meat on the agenda than what you got.
That's set for February 5th.
February 5th than what
Right.
you got yesterday.
So coming up. Before our next topic, I'd like to thank 2 more TribCast sponsors. Thousands of WGU Texas students are getting the opportunity to rewrite their stories thanks to our 21st century approach to higher education, competency-based learning. Learn more at texas.wgu.edu/CBE. And Texans for Consumer Freedom. Court finds Texas retail liquor laws discriminatory and unconstitutional. Learn more at texansforconsumerfreedom.com. So we've got yet another special election. We've got a lot of things going on. The House and Senate haven't named committees yet. There are all kinds of rumors about when that might happen. The Senate is always faster than the House. We'll see how much they beat them by. And I guess that's where we'll start to see any cracks in the system or any continuation of this kumbaya moment about the big issues going forward. But we don't even have a fully populated legislature yet, Alex. We've got some special elections coming up, and we've got a new one declared now, right?
Yeah, so Patrick actually wrote the story earlier this week, but 5 candidates did file to run for the seat vacated by Democrat Justin Rodriguez. San Antonio Democrat. I think there are 4 Democrats and 1 Republican running
Right.
for that seat. And that special election will take place on February 12th. But before that, on January 29th, there are 2 other special elections to fill the seats left by Carol Alvarado, a Democrat who left her seat in the House to run for Sylvia Garcia's seat in the Senate.
Right.
And then Joe Pickett, who resigned from his seat in the House last month, actually stepped down due to health issues. So there will be 2 special elections in January and then 1 in February following that.
Right.
Yeah.
So Houston, El Paso, San Antonio.
Right. And just a quick overview, I think, so far none of these are is turning out to be blockbuster, explosive political events, especially, Joe Pickett's seat. There are 2 Democrats, 1 Republican. There's a pretty clear front runner in one of the Democrats, Art Fierro, who is the chairman of the El Paso Community College Board. And the entire El Paso delegation to the legislature has endorsed him.
Wow. Okay.
So he looks like the clear front runner in that race. In the races for the Rodriguez seat and for the Alvarado seat, obviously you got more crowded fields. There are more Democrats. You have some pretty clear top candidates in those races. For the Alvarado seat, you have Christina Morales, local businesswoman, very well known in that part of Houston. Then you have Melissa Noriega, who briefly held the seat, I believe, in 2005 when her then husband, the incumbent Rick Noriega, served overseas. Still kind of sifting through the field for Democrat, the Justin Rodriguez's seat in San Antonio.
Right.
As Alex pointed out, there's 4 Democrats, 1 Republican. You have some pretty prominent names, relatively speaking, among those Democrats. Ray Lopez, former San Antonio City Council member,
Right.
Art Reyna, who held the seat that Justin Rodriguez went on to hold not briefly, but for I think 3 sessions in the late 90s or early 2000s. So some people with some interesting profiles in these races, but so far they're not turning into.
We're not going to see party flips or anything here.
I don't think so. Yeah, that seems very unlikely. But there's time. These special elections. You wait, and then sometimes in the final few days you see some real contrast being drawn.
Right.
But for now they're pretty low key affairs, I'd say.
Yeah. Well, I want to talk for a minute about we've all been reading about and writing about this kumbaya business with the big 3, and I'm curious what you guys are watching in terms of, what's going to test this. I don't want to say it's going to break down because we don't know it's going to break down. It's already held together longer than I thought it might, but. What are you watching? Is it how they come at school finance, and are there some fault lines there? Is it the property tax thing? I think everybody's sort of carefully walked around on property taxes, gotten around the idea that it's going to be a property tax reduction, and they're talking more about holding property taxes at least where they are if they can. But where do you see potential tests of these relationships? What's the Wednesday morning breakfast going to break up about?
I think I'm looking out for on the property tax conversation. I think both the House and Senate budget proposals sort of open the door to, the governor has put forth a proposal for property tax reform that would also help, recapture, which is, a problem for a lot of the large urban school districts or the wealthier school districts that are paying into recapture. So the governor has a proposal that would help with both of those things. And I think both of the proposals kind of have language that would seem like they could support it. I think the House talks about tax compression. The Senate talks about, I think the Senate actually is closer to what the governor's proposal actually is, where they talk about property tax reform and also, fixing recapture or, providing relief for recapture. And I think they would provide around $2 billion for, if they can get anything passed that would do both of those things. And that's the governor's proposal sort of in a nutshell.
You interviewed the governor. He hadn't done a specific plan yet. What do you see coming there?
Yeah, I was just going to step back and answer your previous question. I think I may have brought this up on a previous TribCast. But, while you have the big 3 all talking about the 3 issues of property tax reform, school finance reform, and a teacher pay raise, there's definitely been differences in emphasis. And I think that suggests where you may see some fracturing here, this kumbaya moment maybe fading away. Greg Abbott, the governor, has definitely emphasized property tax reform more. Again, they're all talking about these issues and saying
Right.
they're priorities, but when you kind of start looking at speeches back to back and seeing what gets mentioned first before the and where they get a little more excited when they talk about it.
Right.
Greg Abbott definitely, I think, has emphasized property tax reform more. Dennis Bonnen has emphasized school finance reform more. He didn't get cups for all the members that said the time for property tax reform is now.
Right.
He said it's the time for school
Right.
finance reform is now. And Dan Patrick, again, has also talked about all those issues, but he, I think, has been a little more emphatic about the teacher pay raise than Greg Abbott and Dennis Bonnen have been. It's an issue that he campaigned on. There's nothing wrong with that. But, again, I just think that you start reading between the lines, there's a difference of emphasis, and that may suggest where there may be some division down the line.
Right. Has Abbott forecast or telegraphed any of his punches? I mean, do you think you have an idea what he's going to propose on February 5th, or are there some prizes out there? Are there some things that you saw in the campaign that haven't gotten any emphasis lately that you think he might punch at in the state of the state, or is it going to be more of the same? More about I mean, his riff right now on property taxes is everywhere I went during the campaign. Everywhere all of us went during the campaign, property
Right.
taxes is what we heard about. Is there something new out there that he's suggested?
I don't think so. I'm not necessarily expecting any huge surprise in the state of the state. Obviously, it's still a few weeks away.
Right.
He has kind of developed and made clear that he has kind of after you get beyond property taxes and school finance reform, that he has kind of a second tier of priorities, if you want to call it that include things like school safety, and finishing some of the proposals from he made after the Santa Fe shooting that require legislative action.
Right.
And so I think he's sketched out kind of a second tier of priorities I expect to come up in the state of the state.
Okay. Alex, do you think these guys keep going along? You've been following Bonnen pretty closely. You saw last session. Do you see any cracks in it right now? Are you surprised how they're getting along?
Not right now. It's still pretty early. I think Patrick said it well, and then you also said it well in your column this morning that, when it comes to school finance, everyone kind of has different priorities in that sense. And like Patrick mentioned, Dan Patrick is really pushing the teacher pay. Bonnen's more talking about pumping more money into schools, and then Abbott's talking about, rewarding schools where students have been doing well.
Right.
So it's like you see the fault lines there, so it'll be interesting to see what happens. But I'm personally watching the school safety debate, so I'm interested to see in how that falls in between school finance and property taxes, and if that kind of falls to the wayside, especially since this is the first session after the Santa Fe shooting, and really when lawmakers, should be getting stuff done.
Right. Yeah, they'll have 5,500 other bills to mess around with. One of the things that I've noticed here is an echo of the Bonnen plan this time, Aaliyah, is similar to, the numbers are different, but it's a similar idea to what the House was pushing at the end of the last legislative session. Put some more money into schools and equal, you have the effect of bringing the state share up a little bit. You put some more money into schools, maybe get some more money into the formulas. And Dan Patrick was on a teacher pay raise of a kind last time. Are these exactly the same, or are they significantly different?
Yeah,
in some way?
I think it's hard, obviously, without policy proposals, but I expect the policy proposals to look different this time around, just based off of what the School Finance Commission, has been recommending that they do, or came out with recommendations that they should do.
Right.
I think the House's proposal, at least, might include some of the things that they tried to do last time, and so that was a lot of wonky fixing the way that money gets distributed to schools, putting more money into the base funding for students. But I think it also might include some what they're calling outcomes-based funding. So basically tying funding to performance, which we haven't done in Texas. And
so this basically would reward districts where students are doing better.
Right. So it would basically give them an incentive to or the pitches, that it would give them an incentive to have more students reading on grade level in third grade if they gave them, however much per student for every third grader reading on grade level. I think that's going to be a pretty controversial part of what's expected to be proposed, just because, for school districts, the idea of tying the amount you get to how well you do is for obvious reasons, not very popular.
Right.
But it's one that I think the big three have all sort of said in their own way. You know, they've all hinted at supporting something that's similar to that. You know, if not specifically the third grade reading one, then giving schools money just for specific programs. You know, I mean, I think the Senate's budget proposal showed that too, where you're giving specific money for teacher pay and nothing else. You know, so it's holding school. What they've said is they're holding schools accountable for how they use the money by, you know, delegating pretty specific uses for how that money is supposed to be used.
Okay. I think that's about it for time. I want to mention that the Texas Tribune has a new podcast, Point of Order, with a fresh, new, stern-looking picture of Evan Smith in the promos, if you see it. It features Evan's one-on-one conversations with elected officials and other news-like creatures from the world of Texas government and politics. You can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcast fix. The current episode features Dan Uberty, right now the public education chairman in the House. They haven't named him for this session. There's some assumptions there. We'll see. Anyway, it's he and Dan talking about big aims for Texas schools in this legislative session. Thanks to Harmony Public Schools, Devils River Conservancy, WGU Texas, and Texans for Consumer Freedom, our sponsors this week. And an extra special thanks to Spoon for our theme music. On behalf of Alex, Aaliyah, Patrick, and our producers Michael Ray and Bobby, this